Okay, so we're going to set up the dynamic ASCD model for the most part in this lecture, and then we'll save some additional analysis for our first lecture tomorrow. So let's jump in. Again, throughout all of this, you should see a lot of things that feel comfortable to you, but there is a lot more going on ultimately in this particular model. So certainly, I think feel free to pause the video at times, especially when we start getting into sort of some of the more complicated mathematical structures. Okay, so really the point of all this is that we are going to try to bridge the gap between the short run and the long run. Now, the thing is that in the short run versus the long run, not only do you have this transition of time, but you also have a transition of priorities, right? So if we think about just like straightforward ways to think about it, in the short run, we tend to think more in terms of fluctuations, primarily of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So therefore, the sort of policy considerations here, end up being on stabilization, inflation management. Again, a lot of the stuff that we have been talking about up to this point. And of course, there's a lot of debate and schools of thought, stabilization, how should you stabilize? Should we be stabilizing at all? Obviously, a lot of that ends up being tied up in this concern over inflation. And we've, of course, covered all of that. And so don't need to sort of elaborate more. Then there's sort of this more long run view. And typically, over the long run, what we are more concerned with is growth. And so we want to promote long run growth. So long run economic growth. And we want to think about raise of living standards. Now, in the sort of policy debate between monetarist and Keynesian, the classicals and neoclassicals, neo-Keynesians, and all this stuff, there's always an implicit assumption at the end that if you get the short run stuff wrong, you're not going to do this stuff either, right? So if you don't get the short run stabilization right, if you don't get the short run inflation management right, then you're not going to get the long run growth. Everybody believes that, right? There's nobody who thinks that you can get the short run management piece wrong from a policy perspective, that you could react to supply shocks poorly, react to other sort of economic dynamics poorly, that ends up getting you long run growth. And so there is, I guess, some sense that we can shortcut this conversation and just say, well, you get the short run stuff right, you get the small stuff right, then you're going to get the big stuff right. There is some truth to that just naturally. If we think especially in terms of kind of two sort of centrally important ideas in macroeconomics, and that is stability, and then kind of part of stability, but then also to some extent somewhat separate, is the idea of uncertainty. These, I guess we could say instability and uncertainty, right? These are terrible for economic systems. If the economy is unstable, if the political system is unstable, if there's a lack of sort of consistency of how things are done, rules, laws, legal systems, so on and so forth, that's going to naturally get in the way of more economic transactions than it otherwise would. That's why a big emphasis in modern macroeconomic research, which we'll cover next week in the endogenous growth models, is on quality of systems, quality of institutions, ultimately really sort of matters. So quality of institutions is there in the sense that there's an assumption that quality institutions are going to end up promoting or sort of putting forward quality policy, right? That's obviously up for question and debate, but that's going to be kind of the idea. And then uncertainty. Now, uncertainty really matters also in terms of these short run fluctuations. I mean, if you just sort of bring in what we've already talked about, inflation expectations, for example, right? Think about uncertainty in a world where inflation expectations are really important. Think about a world in which the output gap, which is mostly about where we are versus where we thought we would be, sort of expectations over output versus where output actually is. So there's a lot of stuff that we sort of generally agree on, but then the sort of one question that was always a little bit sort of not answered is like, how do economies actually grow? Like, what does that process look like? Aggregate supply, aggregate demand, um, short run ISLM analysis, they can't get us there. They just cannot get us to any sort of long run conception. And so therefore do not do well at growth. So what we're going to start with is we're going to take this idea of growth and we're going to sort of bend our ASAD world to make it be a growth model. Ultimately, we'll come to realize that we need to think a little bit differently, most likely in terms of very long economic growth. So there's going to be sort of long run, and then there's going to be very long run, and those will be the models that we talk about next week. All right, so let's move on here. So the big thing that we're doing with the dynamic ASAD is we're going to now think about responses. Not just sort of the initial economic response to, say, a policy or to some shock, but then the secondary, tertiary ripple effects of those particular policies. Because one thing that we're very interested in economics is this concept called persistence, right? To what extent is inflation inertia persistent? To what extent, for example, is a fiscal stimulus going to persistently boost aggregate demand? And what sort of constitutes persistence anyway in the first place is sort of interesting in an economic sense, especially when you have these variable sort of time considerations. Like, what is persistence in the short run? What is persistence over the very long run? The big thing that the dynamic ASAD model does is it now enables us to not only illustrate policy, but to model it and to actually model different versions which line up with different schools of thought, especially as it pertains to monetary policy. The big thing that monetarists and the sort of post Keynesians really did is they really heavily emphasized inflation, which they also really heavily emphasized central banking. Because again, remember, in their world, that was the source of inflation. Inflation came from central banking, and in particular, excessive inflation is going to come from bad central banking. And so what we're going to see here is where the incorporation into the ASAD model of a monetary policy rule. And the rule that we're going to build into the model is going to be an interest rate target. And this really mirrors sort of the way the Fed has come to carry out policy. If we think about sort of the historical trajectory of the U.S. Fed and kind of how it was, so basically, up until the 1960s, the Fed was very passive, didn't really do a whole lot, was sort of kind of post-Great Depression, was sort of mostly focused on ensuring liquidity. And then, really the 1960s, is a time period coming out of the 1950s of just remarkable economic growth. There weren't many sort of economic bad times during this. So the Fed's sort of job, in a sense, was easy. And so the passive policy there probably made a lot of sense. We've already discussed how there is certainly some fairly obviously bad monetary policy at the tail end of the 1960s. In particular, around 1968, the Fed starts targeting lower federal funds rate, despite the fact that inflation has been increasing for some time. It was clear, I would imagine at the time, that the Fed was not worried so much about the inertia effect of inflation, or they never would have dropped the federal funds rate, which is an inflationary policy. And then, so what happens is that the late 1960s, I should say, so say late 1960s to the 1970s, you have what we might refer to as an accommodating Fed. So the idea here is that the Fed gets wrapped up in the world of economic growth and what's going to grow the economy. And so if you think about monetary policy from that perspective, and you're hyper focused on the short run, then it's always going to be loose monetary policy. So lower interest rates to try to spur on investment, to try to grow the economy, right? Think about aggregate demand. It's just trying to boost aggregate demand. That, I think, alongside mismanagement, generally speaking, alongside what was expansionary fiscal policy of the time, clearly leads into that inflationary story. Of course, add on to that the supply shocks of the 1970s as well. And so sort of what you have kind of in the 1970s, or I should say the late 1970s and into the 1980s, is a much more activist Fed, but in a particular way. So not activist in the sense that they're using expansionary monetary policy, but almost uniquely contractionary in terms of their activists. And so obviously we're talking about the Volcker Fed here. And so here it really becomes kind of what I might describe as inflation hawkery, meaning that they were inflation hawk. They were really concerned about inflation. And so you can see that this evolution of the Fed is not really doing a whole lot, good or bad, doing a lot of probably bad stuff, doing a lot of stuff that seemed bad, but was probably what was actually good and needed for the economic system. And then post 1980s, I would describe the Fed as really just being an inflation manager, and a good one at that. A good one. So part of that process is that Fed central bank policy became much more consistent, much more understandable. There was sort of a clear set of goals, and every time the Fed would release statements, they would reinforce those particular goals. And so one of the things that is really going to matter now in this dynamic sense is, as we go through time, as policies ripple through the economy, as shocks ripple through the economy, and as, for example, the Fed sets policy, the central bank sets a particular policy, the question is going to be, to what extent does that alter expectations about the future of those future time periods? And it can kind of go both ways. So you can have a central bank that people trust, and you can have a central bank that people do not trust. And their responses and then the subsequent economic outcomes are certainly in part going to be a function of that particular process. Now, in interest rate targeting, this complicates the process a little bit, whereas, of course, previously the ISLM through the money market was very. All right. Just some differences between these models that you'll no doubt notice as we move through. Instead of thinking about price level, we're actually now going to model inflation. And so in particular, when we talk about the space that we're in here, so instead of it being output and inflation, we're going to think in terms of output output and price level. We're going to think about now in terms of output and inflation. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to think in terms of time periods. So there is a time period structure, YT, and of course, where T is equal to 1, 2, 3, all the way out to time. So we can imagine a model in which we have sort of T time periods. And then what this allows us to do is also to, for example, Let's imagine that the federal government increases government spending for the next 3 time periods, and we can actually model the subsequent boost in aggregate demand, which is going to occur for those 3 particular time periods. The important thing here to also keep in mind is that changes in inflation are going to affect expected inflation, which, because of the Phillips curve and the way that the expected inflation shifts the Phillips curve, is also going to cause shifts in the dynamic aggregate supply curve, which further reinforces that inflation inertia story. That's one of the biggest pieces of dynamic aggregate supply, aggregate demand, is it ends up being a way that we can model inflationary inertia, right? So let's imagine for a moment we have a general aggregate demand function and we have a general aggregate supply function. And then let's say for some particular reason that we have a positive output gap, right? So let's just imagine this is full output. And then, let's say, an aggregate demand boost gives us or puts us at an output gap. Right now we have a positive output gap. This positive output gap, as we talked about in the previous period, is going to increase expected inflation. The difference in the dynamic model is that we build the Phillips curve into the aggregate supply such that the expected inflation is also going to shift aggregate supply. And so what you can see here is this sort of initial boost of aggregate demand is going to get somewhat eaten up by inflation kind of at a certain point. And then those inflation expectations are going to push it further and further and further. And this is, again, if you go back to the previous video, what I was talking about is we just don't quite know where this is all going to stop unless we actually model the time parameters and the persistence parameters of aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So again, what ASAD in a dynamic sense does is it sort of fills the holes ultimately that we have in the traditional aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. A really important reason why we also discuss dynamic AD is its use in modern economic modeling. So another new idea that we're going to introduce in the context of dynamic ASAD is this idea of running simulations. So you can imagine that if you break your economy down into all these structural equations, output behaves this way, expenditure behaves this way, money market behaves this way, that it's not that difficult to basically build a mathematical model that's going to allow you to then simulate, what happens in an economic system when the government runs a stimulus or when the central bank decides to, target higher interest rates, and then sort of, calibrate those models to try to build in as much realism as we can. These models are what we describe as DSGE models. That is dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. We've already talked, this semester about general equilibrium. That's a very modern economic way to think, is instead of just in the static sense, we want to think in a dynamic general sense, sort of thinking about both sides of the economy at the same time. Dynamic because it includes time considerations. And then this sort of stochastic piece refers to the fact that there is going to be an inherent assumption about the sort of stochasticity of economic growth over time relative to economic conditions. So essentially, the argument is that economic conditions put us on a potential growth trajectory. Whether or not we actually get to that growth trajectory is not certain. There's an uncertainty there. And part of that uncertainty is that there is a stochasticity to the economic system, especially when you open it up in a general equilibrium. Because you can imagine that we're not only thinking about supply and demand in the domestic market, now we have to think about supply and demand in both domestic and international markets, because we have to think about exchange rate, we have to think about trade flows and all this various stuff. There's a lot of complication here, but the beauty of this is that we have already covered all of these ideas. These are just ideas that we have been developing all semester long. And so, like I said, I think ultimately, despite there's a lot of complexity here, I think you'll sort of see, oh, okay, this feels quite comfortable. We're going to label sort of 5 endogenous variables in our model. The endogenous means that these are variables that are a function of other variables, so they are determined within the model, as opposed to exogenous variables, which would be determined outside of the model. So for us, that's output, as you would imagine, inflation, the real interest rate, the nominal interest rate. Up to this point, we haven't really made much of a distinction. In fact, we have typically just said real interest rate when we've described it, for example, the money market or ISLM. The interplay between nominal interest rates and real interest rates are incredibly important. Basically, what ends up happening is like every other sort of dynamic here, there's going to be an expectation about interest rates. And that expectation refers to both an expected nominal as well as an expected real. And of course, part of this is going to bring back in the Fisher effect. So again, the ideas that we've already discussed. Expected inflation is we're going to assume equal to just pi e, and we'll talk about the dynamics in a moment. So there's the 5 endogenous variables. Again, we're going to incorporate a time dimension. We're going to do this a lot next week when we get to the solo swan growth model. So it'll be nice to kind of go ahead and get you used to using T subscripts. We did this a little bit also at the beginning of the semester when we were doing micro foundations. It gets a little bit just notationally difficult. So when you actually are drawing the graph or working through the math, the time subscripts can certainly become a little bit burdensome. My suggestion is to just go really slow. I'm always messing up time subscripts, typically just because I'm rushing. So YT is going to be equal to real GDP in time period T. Okay, so the output side of the economy, the demand side of the goods market, that's what we're describing here. Essentially, this is the IS curve. So we're going to have a very sort of straightforward model for the demand for goods. So the demand for goods in time period T is going to be a function of potential output, full employment, output at full employment. And then a relatively simple kind of dynamic here between the real interest rate and then this rho. Okay, we'll talk about rho in just a moment. And then we have also added into this particular model is just a random demand shock. You can think about the random demand shock here in the same way that you may think about an econometric error. Basically, we think that most of what's going to determine output is going to be potential output and then this interplay between interest rates. But we know that there's probably always going to be something, a little bit more or a little bit less adding to or subtracting from output. And so we're modeling that, in a sense, uncertainty. So you'll notice that one of the nice things about the dynamic ASAD model is that we can, again, model some of that uncertainty. We can put that into the structure here. Okay. And going back down here to rho and alpha. So rho and alpha, which we're going to assume are greater than 0, are parameters. So we can see that when the real interest rate equals rho, then we get output is equal to natural output. And so what rho ends up being here is what we're going to call the natural real interest rate. What that means in this particular context is how sensitive, right? How sensitive are investors? How sensitive are those taking out loans? How sensitive are they to the real interest rate, RT, and then where the real interest rate is sort of supposed to be at natural output? Right. So this brings us back to that natural rate hypothesis that was really important to the monetarists, that basically the economy has this sort of natural position that it wants to be at. And when the economy is at that natural position, it has natural settings for variables. So there is a natural real rate of interest in a sense, you can think about that as being the expected real interest rate, right? In the same way that we can essentially assume that natural output is expected output, we can think about the natural real interest rate as being the potential real interest rate here. And so the argument is that where the current interest rate is away from where it was expected to be, that's going to affect output. And in particular, you can see that if the real interest rate is greater than what we expected it to be, that this reduces output. That is because we're going to get less investment than what we were initially expecting to see. And then if the real interest rate is below those expectations, then we see that there is an increase in output. And then alpha here is just the elasticity of investment to changes in real interest rate against the natural real interest rate. Like I said before, this is essentially the IS curve. It has sort of the components of the IS curve. We might think here in terms of natural output or potential output as defining consumption. The second piece, alpha times RT minus P rho rather, is essentially the investment piece. But then that consumption piece is also going to include government spending. So when an economist thinks about like government spending, we typically think about it just in terms of income. We think about it as increases in output. So despite the fact that we don't have a C and a G here, C and G are sort of wrapped up in this particular idea of YT. Now, we're going to model the Fisher effect into our conception of the real interest rate. And in particular, we're going to say that the real interest rate is equal to nominal. So I is the nominal interest rate, and then minus expected inflation next period. Now, I have to say something in particular here that I want to point out, which is that when we say expected inflation next time period, the expectation, importantly, is formed in the current time period. So there's an expectation which is formed in time period T about inflation that will be in time period T plus 1, which is a little bit confusing, but is important to keep your head around here. So basically, the way that we typically will say this is that is expected inflation next time period, given information we have access to in the current time period. Right? That's the simplest way to think about that. So therefore, the real interest rate is going to be equal to whatever the nominal rate is. You can think about nominal rates as being the sticker rate. You go into a bank, you see on the wall, they're advertising, we got CD rates for this, we've got loan interest rates for this. Those are nominal rates. And then the belief here is that what we actually are paying when we pay down our mortgage or when we receive interest income is we're receiving a real interest rate. And so the real interest rate here is that sort of statutory nominal rate minus, again, expectations over future inflation given information in the current time period. Again, important to point out here, we're including the Fisher equation into this particular model. Why are we including the Fisher equation? Because the Fisher equation defines what we think is the relationship between nominal and real interest rates. Why does that end up being so important in this particular model? Because ultimately, we're going to target nominal rates with monetary policy. So we're going to model central bank policy into this framework, and that central bank policy, if you recall, is going to be about targeting a nominal interest rate. So we need to understand what the dynamics are between the nominal rate and expected inflation, because ultimately the nominal rate is what ends up getting the target. Now, realistically, the nominal rate is the stated target, but the central bank, of course, understands this particular relationship. So when they set a nominal target, they have a very clear understanding as to what they want that to be in real terms, which means that a huge, huge part of central bank policy ends up being wrapped up in two questions. What are the current information about future inflation? And then what will that produce in terms of future inflation expectations. That's a big part of central banking policy. Now we model the Phillips curve here as we have before, except the difference here is we're going to think about it in terms of the output gap as opposed to the unemployment gap. We're able to do this due to Okun's law. So if you recall, Okun's law says that we get this negative relationship between output and unemployment. And so typically in the Phillips curve right here, we model an unemployment gap, but instead we're going to model an output gap. But it makes sense here because the output gap is related directly to an unemployment gap. Basically, if you're below potential output, you're going to have an increased unemployment gap. And if you're above potential output, you're going to have a decreased unemployment gap. And again, keep in mind that the inflation we have in time period T is now being modeled with the expectations piece. It's being modeled with the output gap piece. And then we also still get that supply shock piece as well. One thing to keep in mind here is that in both the Phillips curve as well as the IS curve, we get the random shocks added into the model. This was always a really big criticism of Keynesian ISLM and even sort of new classical models, is that they didn't have the random shock component. But you can see how easy it is to include the random shocks. Now, to what extent do these random shocks capture the actual dynamic of a supply shock? We have to make assumptions, right? Which is essentially here, this just says if there is a supply shock, it's going to cause inflation to go up, right? So a negative supply shock is going to cause inflation to go up, or a positive supply shock is going to cause inflation to go down, kind of all else equal. Much like in the context of the Fisher equation, the central bank has to understand the interplay between real and nominal rates. The other thing that the central bank has to grapple with is the responsiveness of inflation to the output gap. And this doesn't necessarily is constant, right? The economy may have different responses to output gaps depending upon other economic considerations. So this is another complicating factor in terms of how we understand inflation. So inflation is going to be based in part on the output gap and expectations about future inflation, but the extent to which inflation actually responds to the output gap is, again, one of those big sort of question marks. Just to give some empirical background, we think that that theta there has been decreasing over time. That it seemed to be that the slope of the Phillips curve was much more steep in the 60s and 70s, and over time has flattened. Again, we're going to build in those quote unquote adaptive expectations. This is just a way for us to sort of model a persistence in inflation, with that inertia in inflation. That's an empirical sort of belief that inflation has inertia, because there are times, if you just look at the data, where it really seems like inflation is sort of moving on its own beyond any sort of other material reasons why it would be moving. And so that's just building in that sort of particular inertia. We could instead build into our model rational expectations. The only difference there is that if we assume rational expectations, it just changes a little bit of the nature of sort of inflation versus expected inflation. It's just another assumption we could make in the model. Here, we're going to choose the simpler adaptive expectations model just for sake of making our lives a lot simpler. All right. One of the big influences of the monetarist turn in macroeconomics was this transition that, it was fine for monetary policy to be sort of this discretion-based policy. There was I'm not so sure back then if it was really as much about flexibility in Fed policy as it was, there just wasn't much of a concern about Fed policy because you didn't get a whole lot of Fed policy back then. Then there was a sense that maybe you got too much Fed policy in the 70s, in particular by accommodating the fiscal policy side under Johnson, Nixon, and then to a lot of extent also Ford. And so people came to really distrust the central bank. Economists came to really distrust central banks because they thought central banks tended to be myopic, that they tended to either not care enough about inflation and or not really know how to care about inflation. And so what came out of this is what we would say is called kind of the rules versus discretion debate in economics. So rules versus discretion. And whether or not this is fair, it certainly is sort of what happened. The rules folks tended to be more monetarist, and the discretion folks tended to be more Keynesian. So for whatever reason, it just tended to kind of fall sort of neatly into these two particular camps. The most important kind of rule-based idea came from the economist Taylor. So from the monetarist influence, there's this development of monetary policy research in the 80s. And from that research, we get what's called the Taylor Rule. And the Taylor Rule is all about the Federal Reserve managing inflation through interest rate targeting. Now, I think it's important to point out that, the monetarist, especially Friedman, he was all about money supply targeting. So it's interesting that the sort of net result of all this is not money supply targeting, but instead interest rate targeting. I think the idea is that interest rate targeting was something the Keynesians got right, that it's easier for the Fed to target interest rates. It's much less convoluted for the Fed to target interest rates than it is for the Fed to target money supply. And in a sense, I think it's just easier to do. But what Taylor argued is that, yeah, it's probably easier to target interest rates, but you still have those same perverse incentives and or myopic analysis that was always the concern. So Taylor shared Friedman's concern over bad monetary policy to the extent that he believed, and still continues to believe today because he's still alive, that monetary policy should not be discretion-based, that it should be rules-based. Now, the nice thing about this, for our perspective, is that building a rule is very simple ultimately and makes the sort of dynamic ASAD model work pretty well. And by the way, we can always change our assumptions about the rule. So what it enables us to do is actually model monetary policy. So in other words, what's going to happen in the model now is that monetary policy is going to react to dynamical changes showing up in other parts of the economy, because ultimately we're going to have this Taylor rule, which says that the target nominal interest rate set by the central bank or targeted by the central bank is essentially going to be a function of current inflation, right? That rho parameter, which is the natural interest rate. Essentially, you can think about that as expected interest rates. We have an inflation gap. Inflation here is the target inflation relative to where we actually are. And then we have the output gap. And so to some extent, the parameters, the two theta parameters, the inflation theta and the output theta, again, measure sort of the extent to which, the rapidity at which the interest rate target is going to change according to this. But I think this is, despite the fact that there's a lot of debate as to whether monetary policy should be rules-based or discretion-based, I would say mainstream economists tend to fall on discretion-based, but with at least a philosophical rule in mind, which is probably cheating a little bit. And I certainly think Taylor would be quite angry about that. He would say, well, then it's just a rule. And I'll show you a slide in a second that kind of it tells a pretty interesting story. But you can see here that we're getting to a very modern conception of central banking policy, and that the central bank does not necessarily always want to target higher nominal rates to reduce inflation. It depends upon what inflation is doing. It depends on what the output gap is doing. And of course, it depends upon what inflation is doing kind of right now. And you get the kind of classic monetary policy suggestions here. So if we're expecting higher inflation, if we get more inflation than we were expecting, then the Fed, is going to respond with a higher targeted nominal rate. If we get a higher output than is expected, this is also going to cause the Fed to target higher rates. And the reason why both of those things, a positive inflation gap, a positive output gap, is because the Phillips curve, Fisher effect, and then now this Taylor rule, by putting them into the model, we have modeled that inertia of inflation explicitly. And so what the Taylor rule does is it creates a stopping of that inflation inertia. If we didn't have the Taylor rule in the model, then the Fed reactive policy would not, well, there wouldn't be Fed reactive policy, and therefore inflation would just go boop, 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 boop. The Taylor rule, and as a result, the central banking policy rule that we're putting into the model exists because otherwise you would get runaway inflation in this particular model. Something to keep in mind. We're going to think about central banking policy as being just about open market operations. So if they want to raise the nominal interest rate, they're going to do contractionary monetary policy. That is the buying of bonds from the market. So they're going to take bonds off the market. I'm sorry, the selling of bonds to the market. They're going to take bonds from their own stock and sell them to the market, taking cash out of the economy. That's going to put upward pressure on nominal interest rates, and then expansionary monetary policy is going to do the opposite. We can still think in terms of ISLM, right? We can still think in that term. Instead of real, we're thinking in terms of nominal, but it's the same dynamic. Expansionary monetary policy would be a reduction in the nominal interest rate target. Contractionary monetary policy would be an increase in the nominal interest rate target. Now, the hard part, of course, of all this is for the central bank to actually pick the nominal interest rate target, because that's how they end up getting their inflation target. If you think back to a couple of videos ago, I talked about one of the sort of big things that happens to fighting inflation when you include expectations into the model is that the sort of Lucas critique combined with Sargent's work sort of illustrated that as soon as you set an inflation target, that inflation target essentially gets washed away through expectation. So that the only way that you actually achieve an inflation target in this particular way of thinking is by targeting a nominal interest rate, and then the behavioral response to that nominal interest rate is going to produce an inflation rate, is essentially the idea. So it goes back to this idea that you can't directly target an inflation rate, that the only way to get to the inflation rate is to actually target an interest rate, and then the interest rate targeting produces an inflation target. Now, in the real world, in terms of like the central bank, in the US, the central bank has a discount rate. That's the rate that banks pay to the Fed as the lender of last resort. That gives them influence over the federal funds rate. The discount rate creates the lower bound on the federal funds rate. And so the Fed moves the discount rate, this influences the federal funds rate, and then when they influence the federal funds rate, the idea would be this creates the nominal interest rate. So from kind of tying this idea to the actual Federal Reserve, when we say that the Federal Reserve is targeting higher or lower interest rates, what that means is that they're setting the discount rate higher or lower, which then pushes the federal funds rate higher or lower, which then translates in some transmission mechanism into higher and lower interest rates across the broader economy. Although that's a really important discussion. To what extent does Federal Reserve policy and how quickly does it translate into actual changes in nominal interest rates? And then, because the concern here would be you're targeting a particular nominal interest rate. You're targeting that nominal interest rate because you're really targeting a real interest rate, right? And you have inflation expectations, and that's going to inform you as to what you think the real rate is eventually going to be relative to whatever nominal rate you are targeting. The nominal rate itself, however, is influenced by, as we've seen, the inflation gap, but that inflation gap is partly about expectations. And then the output gap, which is somewhat about expectations, but more so about potential output relative to where we are. You also get, by the way, that sort of idea of overcooking the economy should correspond to contractionary monetary policy. So if you have a positive output gap, the target nominal rate should go up. And if you have a negative output gap, the targeted rate should go down. That's fairly Keynesian in perspective, right? So despite the fact that John Taylor, famously of the Taylor rule, I don't think would consider himself a Keynesian, it's interesting to me that his rule still very much has the Keynesian perspective of demand management, right? In fact, it embeds demand management into its monetary policy rule. Just saying. And then to kind of sort of put an interesting spin on this, the Fed has never adopted the Taylor rule explicitly. The Fed has never adopted a rule at all. In fact, technically, Fed policy has been completely discretionary. But when you model the actual targeted nominal rate relative to the Taylor rule, you get remarkable similarities. The idea is that actually the Fed has been behaving according to the Taylor rule, even though they have not formally adopted the Taylor rule, which is very, very interesting and sort of begs the question, why? Why does the Fed behave according to the Taylor rule, even though they haven't adopted the explicit Taylor rule? And I think the answer is because the Taylor rule is a fantastic bit of monetary policy. And I think if the Fed has followed what has essentially been very close to a Taylor rule, and you look at the behavior of inflation and output and unemployment, it's hard for us to sort of argue that the Taylor rule, or at least the philosophy, which very well seems to be influential, it's hard for us to say that that would sort of be bad. And I think what's happened with Taylor is that, Taylor comes from this monetarist perspective, heavily influenced by the Lucas critique and all these folks, who ends up aligning himself, very much with Friedman and therefore kind of cast himself kind of against Keynesians. I think he's doing that sort of out of defensiveness. I don't necessarily think that he's that far away from them. But I think what Taylor was, again, he's coming from the tradition of being very, very worried about inflation. And to him, the rule is about keeping inflation in line and removing human error from it. Now, I remember, the joke about this with Taylor is that he wanted to remove human error except for his own, because it was his rule, he came up with it. So he's like, I don't think there should be discretion, except I think you should follow this rule that I came up with, But, sometimes people come up with things that are so smart and so intelligent that it does end up still being a very good idea. This happened certainly with Keynes. I think it happened with Friedman. I think it happened with Taylor. It happened with a lot of economists going forward. So I think the beauty of the ASAD sort of framework in the dynamic sense is that it really brings all of this stuff together, and you see all the different influences across economic time and space. So here are the 5 equations. Again, those 5 endogenous variables that we're interested in. We get real output from the IS curve. We get the real interest rate from the Fisher effect. We get the inflation from the Phillips curve. We get expected inflation from adapted expectations. And we get the nominal interest rate target from the Taylor rule. So you just sort of put all these things together, right? And then you just have all these other kind of secondary pieces here. Just some definitional way we label things. Again, we're just kind of setting up the model. We'll dig into the dynamics more tomorrow. And again, we want to pay attention to this time period thing. Again, just as a case in point, we'll notice here again that expectations are formed in the current time period, but about future inflation, which is going to have some interesting interplay moving forward. Okay. And then basically, we're just going to real quickly talk about the sort of the state of the economy, how we think it's going to equilibrate, and then how we might believe it sort of fluctuates. The only way we get long-run equilibrium in this dynamic world is no shock. That's important. Basically, that says the presence of a shock always throws the economy off equilibrium. That's a non-classical way of thinking. To the classicals, there really weren't shocks. The economy was always sort of in equilibrium. And now we're saying, no, in fact, there can be shocks. And when there are shocks, we will not be in equilibrium. So in other words, there is a natural state of the economy. There is an equilibrium in the economy. It is heading in that direction, but shocks may very well knock us off that particular direction. And shock can show up in a lot of different ways. Shock can show up in inflation expectation. Shock can show up directly in output. So there's a lot of concern there about those particular shocks. But if we assume no shocks, those variables drop out. And we also get constant inflation. So that means that inflation last period is simply equal to inflation this period, and that's because of those expectations. And so when you drop out those conditions into our 5 equations, you get these long-run variables as before. So in equilibrium, output is equal to potential output. Real interest rate is equal to the natural real interest rate. Inflation is equal to the target. Expected inflation is equal to the target. And the nominal interest rate target is equal to the inflation target plus this real natural interest rate. So notice here, I guess maybe the only kind of important thing here to point out is that in terms of that Fisher effect, Taylor rule piece, so this is the Taylor rule. This says that the nominal interest rate target should be equal to that natural real interest rate target plus the inflation target. So you get that classic Fisher effect. So you have Fisher effect stuff, so you have classical economics, you have IS and money market stuff in here. So you have the Keynesian, you have monetarist stuff. It's all there, and it's all beautiful, and it's all economic. All right, so this gives us a dynamic aggregate supply curve. Again, we're going to think in terms of inflation and output as opposed to price level and output. And then we get, I'll jump here, a dynamic aggregate demand curve. Again, downward sloping as we would expect. And then we get equilibrium in this particular model. But I'm actually going to stop it here. We'll talk more about equilibrium. I'll take you through some numerical examples tomorrow. And we'll just, again, set up a bunch of policy experiments. And the big question tomorrow is going to be, okay, now that we've modeled all of this dynamic stuff in, now that we've modeled all this time, Taylor rule, what can we now say about prescriptive policy in the face of economic dysfunction, so recessionary responses, prescriptive policy in response to inflationary pressure wrought by negative supply shock or positive demand shock. And then the sort of end result of this process is going to be, what does this say and not say about long-run economic growth? And the spoiler alert is here that we are going to come up just short of sort of feeling very good about it. And then therefore are going to have to turn to actual growth models next week to really get a handle on that long run economic growth.